The winter of 1944 didn't just kill men, it hollowed them out. In the Hürtgen Forest, the trees were so thick they blotted out the sun, leaving the 4th Infantry Division to rot in a perpetual frozen twilight. The mud was the color of a fresh bruise, and the air tasted of cordite and decomposing pine needles. Captain Miller stood inside a command tent that smelled of wet canvas and desperation. On the map before him, Hill 203 was circled in jagged red ink. For 3 days, that hill had breathed fire. Every time Miller sent a platoon into the tree line, the German MG-42s, the Hitler's buzzsaws, would scream, and 10 minutes later, the snow would be stained a permanent dark crimson. I asked for an artillery barrage. "Colonel," Miller snapped, his voice cracking from exhaustion, "I asked for a hammer to break that line. Instead, you sent me this?" Miller gestured toward the corner of the tent. Standing in the shadows was a man who looked like he had been carved out of the very earth they were fighting over. His name was Naiche. He was an Apache scout, but to the young, shivering GIs outside, he was a relic. He didn't wear the standard-issue M1 helmet. Instead, he wore a wool watch cap pulled low over deep-set obsidian eyes. He didn't carry the M1 Garand rifle that every other man in the 4th Infantry treated like a lover. In his hand, Naiche held a knife, but it wasn't the steel kabar issued to the Marines. It was a blade of black volcanic glass, obsidian, bound to a handle of bleached elk bone with dried sinew. "With all due respect, Captain," the colonel's voice was low, "that man has cleared more ground in the Pacific than your entire company has in France. He doesn't need your artillery. He is the artillery." Miller let out a short, bitter laugh. "It's a rock, Colonel. He's bringing a stone to a machine gun fight. The Krauts have fortified bunkers, tripwires, and enough lead to sink a battleship. What's he going to do? Scalp the entire Third Reich?" Outside the tent, word had spread. A group of fresh reinforcements, boys from Ohio and Pennsylvania, who still had the shine on their boots, gathered around as Naiche stepped out into the biting wind. "Hey, Chief!" one of them called out, a lanky private with a cigarette dangling from his lip. "You lose your rifle in the woods? Or did you think we were heading to a museum?" The group erupted into snickering. A young lieutenant, newly arrived from West Point and desperate to assert authority, stepped forward. He tapped the hilt of his own polished steel bayonet. "You know, they make these things out of metal now, Naiche. Better for the 20th century. That glass of yours, one hit against a German belt buckle, and it'll shatter like a window pane." Naiche didn't respond with words. He didn't even look at the lieutenant. He reached into a small leather pouch at his side and pulled out a whetstone. The sound of the stone against the obsidian was a dry, rhythmic scritch, scritch, scritch that seemed to sync with the beating of Miller's heart. For a moment, the laughter died down. There was something in Naiche's stillness that was unnerving, while the soldiers around him fidgeted, stomped their feet to stay warm, and checked their watches. Naiche stood like a statue. He wasn't just ignoring the mockery. He was waiting. He was waiting for the sun to drop. He was waiting for the moment when the world belonged to the things that move without sound. "Listen to me, archaeologist," the lieutenant sneered, leaning in close. "Tomorrow morning at 0400, my boys are going up that hill. If you're not dead by then, try to stay out of our way. We've got a real war to win, and we don't have time to go looking for your lost arrowheads." Naiche finally looked up. His eyes didn't hold anger. They held a profound, predatory pity. He spoke for the first time, his voice a low rasp that sounded like dry leaves skittering over a grave. "The metal makes noise," Naiche said. "The powder makes smoke. Your war is loud, Lieutenant. But death is quiet." He turned and walked toward the edge of the camp, disappearing into the fog before the lieutenant could find a comeback. As the shadows of the Hürtgen Forest swallowed him, the mocking grins of the soldiers began to fade. They looked at the dark, impenetrable wall of trees on Hill 203. They looked at their rifles. For the first time, they realized that in a forest that thick, a rifle was only useful if you could see what you were shooting at. And Naiche had already become part of the dark. The German line on Hill 203 wasn't just a series of holes in the ground. It was an industrial slaughterhouse. To the men of the 4th Infantry, it was known as the meat grinder. Built into the limestone ridges of the forest were concrete pillboxes with interlocking fields of fire. The Germans had spent weeks ranging every inch of the approach. They knew exactly where a man would trip over a root, exactly where a squad would bunch up for cover, and exactly how many seconds it took to turn that cover into a tomb. At 2200 hours, the fog rolled in, a thick, milky soup that tasted of sulfur and wet iron. In the American camp, the air was thick with the scent of fear. Men were writing letters home by the dim glow of shaded flashlights, their hands shaking as the distant thud, thud, thud of German mortars reminded them of their mortality. But on the far edge of the perimeter, near a jagged outcropping of rock, there was a different kind of preparation. Naiche sat in total darkness. He didn't need a light. He worked by touch. A skill passed down through generations of men who hunted in the moonless stretches of the Sonoran Desert. He began the ritual of stripping away the soldier. First went the heavy M1943 field jacket, its stiff fabric too prone to rustling against branches. Then the webbing, the clinking canteens, and the brass-heavy ammunition belts. He stripped down to a thin, dark wool undershirt and trousers he had modified with strips of burlap to break up his silhouette. He took a handful of damp soot from a cold fire pit and smeared it across his high cheekbones and forehead, erasing the moonlight-reflecting pale of his skin. Finally, he picked up the obsidian blade. He ran his thumb parallel to the edge, not touching it, for this glass was capable of severing a nerve before the brain could register pain. This was not a weapon of war. It was a weapon of the hunt. In the Apache way, you did not fight the enemy. You became the air they breathed. You became the shadow they ignored. "You're really going, aren't you?" Naiche didn't turn. He knew the scent, cheap tobacco and nervous sweat. It was the young lieutenant from the tent. He was standing a few feet away, clutching his carbine as if it were a life-preserver. "The colonel is insane," the lieutenant whispered, his bravado from earlier replaced by a hollow, wide-eyed stare. "There's a full company of Fallschirmjäger up there, elite paratroopers. They've got trip flares every 10 yards. You step on a dry twig, and they'll light up the forest like a 4th of July parade. You won't even get past the wire." Naiche stood up. He moved so fluidly that the lieutenant jumped back, nearly tripping over a supply crate. Naiche reached out and placed a hand on the officer's chest, right over his heart. "Your heart is a drum," Naiche said quietly. "The Germans, they listen to the drums. They listen for the metal. They listen for fear. I have no drum. I have no fear. I am only the wind." Before the lieutenant could respond, Naiche stepped into the fog. He didn't walk. He simply vanished. One moment he was a dark shape against the rocks, and the next he was gone. There was no sound of a footfall, no snapping of a branch, not even the rustle of fabric. The lieutenant stood alone in the dark, shivering. He looked down at his own heavy boots, his clanking gear, and his loud, metallic rifle. For the first time he felt exposed. He felt like a beacon of noise in a world that had suddenly gone silent. 300 yards away, the first German sentry was huddled in a shallow foxhole. He was a veteran of the Eastern Front, a man who had survived the horrors of Stalingrad. He prided himself on his front ear, the ability to hear a Russian scout crawling through the snow from 50 yards away. He sat with his back to a pine tree, his MP-40 submachine gun across his lap, staring into the gray void of the fog. The German heard the wind. He heard the distant groan of a falling branch. He heard the rhythmic ticking of his own watch. What he didn't hear was the man standing less than 2 feet behind him. Naiche was so close he could smell the stale schnapps on the German's breath. He waited, his breathing synchronized perfectly with the German's own inhalations. He was a ghost in the machine of the Third Reich, waiting for the precise second to bring the Stone Age crashing into the 20th century. The German reached into his pocket for a lighter. The small, metallic clink. The Zippo-style lid was the loudest sound in the world. It was also the last thing he ever heard. The transition from the forest floor to the German trench line was not a distance measured in yards, but in heartbeats. As Naiche moved, he became a master of the dead space, those pockets of shadow where the interlocking fire of the pillboxes couldn't reach. He moved in a low crouch, his weight distributed so perfectly that he could step on a frozen leaf and suppress the sound of its crunch by rolling his foot from heel to outer edge. The German perimeter was a masterpiece of lethal engineering. Beyond the first line of foxholes lay a belt of S-mines, the infamous bouncing Bettys. One wrong step would trigger a canister that leaped waist-high into the air before exploding into a cloud of steel ball bearings. To a modern soldier, this was an invisible wall. To Naiche, it was merely another pattern in the earth. He felt the tension of the tripwires, with the hairs on his shins, stepping over them with the grace of a mountain lion. He reached the lip of the main trench. It was a jagged scar in the earth, reinforced with timber and lined with duckboards that floated in a slurry of mud and blood. Below him, the trench hummed with the domestic sounds of men who believed they were safe behind their steel. A stove flickered in a dugout, casting a warm orange glow against the wet wood. He heard the murmur of German, the low, guttural cadence of a letter being read aloud. He smelled wood smoke, cabbage, and the sharp ozone scent of gun oil. The Germans felt secure. They had the MG-42s mounted on the parapets, their barrels pointed toward the American lines. They had the potato masher grenades lined up in neat rows. They were waiting for a loud, clumsy frontal assault. They were prepared for a war of thunder. They were entirely unprepared for a war of silence. Naiche dropped into the trench. He didn't jump. He slid down the muddy wall like a shadow detached from its owner. He landed on the wooden boards at the exact moment a distant American shell detonated a mile away, using the vibration of the earth to mask the thud of his feet. The first target was the machine gun nest. 2 Germans sat behind the MG-42, their shoulders slumped under heavy greatcoats. One was staring through a periscope. The other was blowing on his hands to keep the circulation moving. Naiche didn't rush. He moved with the slow, agonizing patience of a predator that has all night to kill. He was 5 feet away. 4, 3. The German with the cold hands turned his head, sensing a shift in the air, a presence that shouldn't be there. He didn't see a man. He saw a ghost of soot and burlap blending into the timber walls. Before the German could draw breath to scream, the obsidian blade moved. It was a strike of terrifying efficiency. The volcanic glass, honed to an edge only a few molecules thick, didn't tear flesh. It parted it. Naiche caught the man's chin with his left hand, tilting the head back to expose the throat, and drew the blade across in one continuous fluid motion. No sound escaped, only the soft, wet hiss of a severed windpipe. Naiche caught the body before it hit the floor, easing it down into the mud. The second German, still peering through the periscope, felt a spray of something warm and copper-smelling hit his cheek. He turned, his eyes widening, as he saw his partner slumped over and a dark figure standing over him with a blade that seemed to swallow the light. He reached for his Luger, but his fingers never touched the leather holster. Naiche's hand was already there, his thumb pressing into a nerve cluster in the German's neck, while the obsidian edge found its mark under the ribs, angled upward toward the heart. The gunner collapsed into Naiche's arms. The scout lowered him gently, almost tenderly, onto the ammunition crates. The MG-42 was silent. The nest was clear. Naiche stood in the center of the trench, his chest rising and falling in a slow, controlled rhythm. He looked down the long, winding throat of the German line. He could see the silhouettes of more men further down, huddled around a brazier. He felt the weight of his ancestors in the obsidian handle. They had been erased from the history of the plains, but tonight their methods were the only thing that existed. He wasn't just clearing a trench, he was reclaiming a legacy. He wiped the blade on the German's wool coat and stepped back into the shadows. There were 30 more men in this sector. They were all sleeping, eating, or waiting for a war that had already arrived in the form of a man with a stone. By midnight, the German trench had become a house of whispers and sudden unfinished shadows. The air inside the dugout was thick with the smell of scorched coffee and the damp metallic tang of blood that the cold refused to let congeal. Naiche moved with a terrifying methodology. He was no longer just a scout. He was a surgeon of the dark. He had bypassed the main corridors to work the auxiliary tunnels first, the places where the messengers slept and the ammunition was stored. He understood the psychology of the modern soldier. They were trained to look for a front, a line, a defined enemy. They were not prepared for a threat that existed within their own sanctuary. And in the central bunker, a German sergeant, a veteran of the siege of Sevastopol, sat at a small wooden table cleaning his fingernails with a bayonet. He was a man of iron nerves, but for the last hour, a primal itch had been crawling up his spine. The trench was too quiet. "Hans!" the sergeant called out, his voice echoing flatly against the reinforced concrete. No answer, only the low whistle of the wind through the ventilation slit. "Hans, if you're asleep on watch again, I'll have you on latrine duty for a month." He stood up, his boots clattering on the duckboards, a sound that felt dangerously loud in the oppressive silence. He stepped out into the main trench line, his hand resting on the grip of his holster. He walked 10 paces toward the forward observation post. He saw the silhouette of a man slumped against the wall. "Hans, you lazy pig, wake up." He grabbed the man's shoulder to shake him. Hans didn't wake up. Instead, his body slid sideways, his head lolling at an impossible angle. In the dim, flickering light of a nearby lantern, the sergeant saw it. A clean, surgical opening at the base of the skull. No bullet wound, no powder burns, just a deep precision cut that looked as if it had been made by a ghost. The sergeant's breath hitched. He reached for his whistle to sound the alarm, but as he filled his lungs, a hand that felt like cold leather clamped over his mouth. Naiche didn't strike immediately. He held the sergeant, feeling the frantic, hammering rhythm of the man's heart against his own chest. For a split second, the Apache scout allowed the German to feel the sheer, overwhelming presence of the Stone Age. He wanted the invader to know that all the steel in the Ruhr Valley couldn't save him from a fragment of the earth. The obsidian blade flashed once in the lamplight. The sergeant fell without a sound, joining the growing ranks of the silent. Naiche moved on. He reached the communications hub. Inside, a young radio operator was frantically turning dials, his headset slipping off one ear. "Headquarters, this is Sector Blue. We have lost contact with Outposts 3 and 4. Send a flare. We need light. There is something in the—" The operator never finished the sentence. A dark shape detached itself from the shadows of the doorway. The obsidian blade didn't just kill, it silenced. It severed the cords of communication, both electronic and human. By 0200 hours, the impossible wall was a tomb. Of the 32 men stationed in the sector, 28 were already dead. They had died in their sleep, died while eating, died while waiting for an enemy they thought was hundreds of yards away. The remaining 4 Germans were huddled in the final pillbox, their nerves completely shattered. They had heard nothing, but they felt the absence of their comrades. It was a sensory vacuum. One of them, a boy no older than 18, began to sob quietly, clutching a grenade with a trembling hand. "It's a Waldgeist, boy," the boy whispered. "A forest spirit. The bullets won't stop it." Outside the pillbox door, Naiche stood in the freezing sleet. He was covered in the blood of his enemies, but his heart rate was as steady as the mountain. He didn't use a grenade to clear the final room. He didn't use a flamethrower. He reached down and picked up a discarded German helmet. He tossed it into the center of the trench, 30 feet away. The sound of the metal clattering against the wood was like a lightning bolt. Inside the pillbox, the panic boiled over. "There! Behind the crates!" the German corporal screamed. All 4 men opened fire at once, their MP-40s and rifles spitting lead into the empty dark, wasting their ammunition on a ghost. Naiche didn't flinch. He waited for the inevitable click of empty chambers, the sound of modern technology failing its masters. When the silence returned, it was heavier than before. He stepped into the doorway of the pillbox. The Germans looked up, their eyes reflecting the terrifying sight of a man who looked like he had risen from the prehistoric mud. He wasn't a soldier of the 4th Infantry. He was the vengeful shadow of a people the world had tried to forget. The obsidian blade was raised. The Stone Age had arrived for the final time. The dawn did not break over the Hürtgen Forest. It simply bled into it. A sickly gray light filtered through the canopy, illuminating a mist so thick it felt like breathing wet wool. At 0400 hours, the American line went into condition red. On Hill 203, the young lieutenant, the one who had mocked the obsidian blade, stood in a frozen foxhole, his knuckles white as he gripped his M1 carbine. "Steady, boys," he whispered, though his own teeth were chattering. "When the whistle blows, we move in waves. Mortars first, then we hit the wire. If the chief didn't make it, we do it the hard way." Behind him, a platoon of GIs checked their bayonets and adjusted their heavy packs. They were prepared for the meat grinder. They were prepared for the screaming of the MG-42s and the explosive rain of the bouncing Bettys. They waited for the signal. The whistle blew. The Americans surged forward, screaming as they breached the first line of timber. They expected a wall of lead. They expected the forest to erupt in fire, but there was nothing. The woods remained eerily, unnervingly silent. As the lieutenant scrambled over the final ridge and reached the German wire, he stopped dead. His boots skidded in the mud. The wire, the impenetrable barrier, had been sliced clean. The heavy steel strands parted as if they were made of silk. "Search the perimeter," the lieutenant barked, his voice sounding thin and alien in the stillness. "Watch the pillboxes. It's a trap." The squad moved into the main trench, rifles raised, fingers twitching on triggers. They rounded the first zigzag corner, and the first man in line vomited instantly. The lieutenant pushed past him, his bravado ready to snap. He looked down and felt the air leave his lungs. There, slumped against the firing step, was the German sentry who had held the periscope. There was no struggle, no signs of a fight, just a single dark line across his throat that looked as precise as a surgeon's incision. As they moved deeper into the trench system, the horror escalated from a military engagement into something psychological. In the mess hall, 3 Germans sat at a table, their heads resting on their chests. One still had a piece of bread in his hand. They looked like they were sleeping, but the dark, drying pools on the floor told a different story. "My God," a corporal whispered, crossing himself. "He didn't kill them. He deleted them." They reached the central communications hub. The lieutenant stepped over the bodies of the radio operators and entered the final concrete pillbox, the one that had held the elite Fallschirmjäger. The interior was riddled with bullet holes from the Germans' own frantic, panicked firing into the empty dark. The walls were scarred, and the floor was littered with empty brass casings. But in the center of the room, sitting on a crate of ammunition, was Naiche. He had washed the soot from his face, but the copper scent of the night still clung to him. He was methodically cleaning his obsidian blade with a strip of silk cut from a captured German parachute. He didn't look up when the Americans entered. He didn't look like a man who had just won a battle. He looked like a man who had finished a long day's work in the fields. The lieutenant looked at the blade, the museum piece, and then at the 4 dead paratroopers surrounding the scout. He remembered his own words about real war and modern metal. He felt a wave of shame so cold it burned. "You cleared it," the lieutenant said, his voice barely a whisper. "The whole sector, alone." Naiche finally looked up. His eyes were tired, but they held the ancient, steady light of a mountain. He didn't offer a boast. He didn't ask for a medal. He reached into his pouch, pulled out a small, notched stick, and tossed it at the lieutenant's feet. It was a counting coup stick. The traditional way an Apache warrior proved he had touched his enemy without being harmed. "Your war is very loud, Lieutenant," Naiche said, stood up, and sheathed the obsidian blade against his hip. "But silence is the only thing the earth remembers." As the rest of the 4th Infantry moved in to occupy the ridge, they walked past Naiche in a silence of their own. There were no cheers, no celebratory shouts. The GIs looked at the Apache scout with a mixture of profound gratitude and a new, deep-seated fear. They realized that they had been saved by a man who lived in a world they could no longer understand, a world where the Stone Age wasn't a period in a book, but a terrifying living mastery over life and death. The most impossible wall had fallen, not to the hammer of industrial artillery, but to the needlepoint precision of a ghost who never needed a single bullet to change the course of history. The victory at Hill 203 should have been the turning point of the Hürtgen campaign. By all military logic, Naiche should have been standing on a podium in Paris, receiving the Medal of Honor from Eisenhower himself. But as the sun climbed higher over the blood-soaked ridge, a different kind of machinery began to turn, not the machinery of war, but the machinery of silence. By 0900 hours, a black sedan, looking entirely out of place among the olive-drab jeeps and muddy half-tracks, pulled into the 4th Infantry's forward command post. Two men in charcoal overcoats, their faces as expressionless as the concrete bunkers Naiche had just cleared, stepped out. They weren't in the army. They carried leather briefcases and special intelligence credentials that overrode even the colonel's authority. "Where is the scout?" the taller one asked, his voice devoid of any emotion. Captain Miller, still reeling from what he had seen in the trench, pointed toward the edge of the camp. "He's with the men. He just saved a battalion, in case you were wondering." The men in overcoats didn't thank him. They didn't even acknowledge the victory. They walked straight to Naiche, who was sitting alone, his obsidian blade tucked back into its buckskin sheath. They spoke to him in low tones for 10 minutes. No one heard the conversation, but the soldiers watching noticed that Naiche didn't argue. He didn't nod. He simply stood up, grabbed his small pack, and walked toward the black sedan. "Hey, where are you taking him?" the young lieutenant shouted, stepping forward. He felt a sudden, fierce protectiveness over the man he had mocked only 24 hours prior. "He belongs with us. He's 4th Infantry." One of the men in overcoats stopped and looked at the lieutenant. "Son, as far as the United States Army is concerned, this man was never in the Hürtgen Forest. He was never in the 4th Infantry. In fact, if you look at the morning's revised roster, he doesn't exist at all." He handed the lieutenant a clipboard. The lieutenant's eyes scanned the list of names. His own was there. Miller's was there. But the line, "Where Naiche Scout Specialist," had been typed as a solid block of black ink. "What is this?" the lieutenant stammered. "He cleared the trench. We saw the bodies. We saw the blade." "You saw a statistical anomaly," the official replied coldly. "You saw a localized German collapse due to internal panic. If you report anything else, anything about stone blades or Apache shadows, you will be brought up on charges of combat psychosis. Do I make myself clear?" The car door slammed. The sedan turned and disappeared into the fog, taking Naiche with it. In the weeks that followed, the meat grinder of the Hürtgen Forest continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. The men who had been in that trench didn't talk about the victory. They became a lost company of sorts, haunted not by what the Germans had done to them, but by what they had seen an American do to the Germans. Every time a report was filed, the mention of Hill 203's silent breach was edited. The deaths of the 32 Germans were officially attributed to a highly effective pre-dawn mortar barrage, despite the fact that not a single shell had been fired that night. The obsidian blade, the bone handle, the notched coup stick, they were all gathered by the men in overcoats and placed into crates marked with a level of classification that wouldn't be unsealed for 80 years. Naiche was erased. He became a ghost within his own lifetime, a man whose greatest contribution to the war was deemed too disturbing for the American public to handle. The government realized that while they could control a soldier with a rifle, they couldn't control the legend of a man who didn't need one. As the 4th Infantry moved deeper into Germany, The lieutenant found himself looking at the shadows of the trees every night. He no longer mocked the Stone Age, he feared it, because he knew that somewhere, in another forest or another dark corner of the world, the men in the black sedans were letting the ghost out of his cage again. The aftermath of Hill 203 didn't end with a medal ceremony or a headline in the Stars and Stripes. In fact, for the men of the 4th Infantry, the official records of that night seemed to dissolve as quickly as the morning fog. When the after-action reports reached Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, they were met with a chilling bureaucratic paralysis. How could the United States Army explain to the public, or to the grieving families of the enemy, that a single man with a primitive blade had neutralized a fortified sector that an entire battalion of industrial might couldn't touch? The answer was simple. They didn't. Naiche was transferred out of the division within 48 hours. There were no handshakes from the lieutenant, who couldn't look the scout in the eye without seeing the ghosts of the men in that trench. There were no victory parades. The Apache scout was moved to a special projects unit, his name scrubbed from the active roster of the 4th Infantry and replaced by a series of alphanumeric codes. As the years turned into decades, the story of the obsidian blade became a whispered legend among the veterans of the Hürtgen Forest, a story told in hushed tones in VFW halls, often dismissed as combat fatigue or trench madness. But the truth remained buried in the National Archives Annex, categorized under alternative psychological warfare. The military had learned a terrifying lesson on Hill 203, that technology, for all its power, creates a dependency on noise. We have built a civilization that believes louder is better, that faster is stronger, and that steel is superior to spirit. But as Naiche proved in the frozen dark of 1944, when the machines fail and the power goes out, the Stone Age is never truly gone. It is merely waiting in the shadows. There is a final moral to the story of the scout they mocked. It is a reminder that progress is often an illusion that blinds us to our own senses. We have traded our intuition for instruments and our silence for screams. We look at the past and call it primitive, yet we find ourselves shivering in the dark whenever the modern world flickers. Ultimately, this is more than a war story. It is a spiritual reckoning. It challenges us to ask, what have we lost in our rush toward the future? Have we become so loud that we can no longer hear the wind that Naiche spoke of? In a world filled with the roar of digital noise and the clashing of iron, perhaps the greatest strength we can reclaim is the quiet precision of the soul. The obsidian blade was sharp, but it was the hand that held it, the spirit that remained connected to the earth, that truly cleared the path. History may have edited the records, and the government may have sealed the vaults, but the truth doesn't need a file cabinet to survive. It lives in the silence of the forest. It lives in the memory of the blood. And it lives in the realization that the oldest ways are often the truest ways to find our way back to the light.